the United States on the East Coast, but I thought I would try and fit this in. I live in the Southern Hemisphere, and so it's a little bit tricky fitting in my live streams. Anyway, so my vegan live streams. So anyway, I wanted to talk about 10 plus things everyone needs to know about salmon farming. Firstly, I just wanted to talk about, according to the United Nations, we've already fished 90% of the ocean's large predatory fishes like tuna or salmon, and over 70% of the world's fisheries are considered significantly depleted or exploited. So that doesn't sound very sustainable. People are often saying they want to get, they're looking for these sustainable solutions, but really they don't really exist. And, as vegan, there's no such thing as sustainable, really, as well as there's no such thing as ethical exploitation. So I'm going to share a few quotes from various scientists about fish sentience before I talk about the factory farming of salmon. And so the first one is by a Professor Bill Runciman, who is a professor of anesthesia and intensive care, Adelaide University. And he says, quote, "Fish constitute the greatest source of confused thinking and inconsistency on Earth at the moment with respect to pain. You will get people very excited about dolphins because they are mammals, and about horses and dogs if they are not treated properly. At the same time, you will have fishing competitions on the River Murray, at which thousands of people snare fish with hooks and allow them to asphyxiate on the banks, which is a fairly uncomfortable and miserable death." So that was Professor Bill Runciman. And I'll share one by Dr. R. Bawalda. He said, "Fish are not mere reflex automatons, but animals capable of experiencing pain and fear and influenced behaviorally by experience, expectancies and motivational state in a manner analogous to that in higher animals up to man, endeavoring to escape and by so doing demonstrate they have a will to survive." So that's this image is of tilapia, I think they're called. Excuse me. These fish are often raised in ditches. You'll see people talking about permaculture and raising these tilapia in ditches, which are, terrible, really, for these fish. I mean, they're sentient. And, as you can see in this particular image, they're really crammed in. They're not able to do any of their natural behaviors. And eventually, of course, they're just left to asphyxiate, and then they're eaten. And there's a tremendous amount of waste in there as well. This is the life of sentient beings that are raised, whether in permaculture or factory farming. They're crammed in, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the last quote by a particular Dr. Donald Broome, a scientific advisor to the British government, he said, "The scientific literature is quite clear. Anatomically, physiologically, and biologically, the pain system in fish is virtually the same as in birds and mammals." So I don't if we can ignore sentience, but I mean, it's very clear there's no debate about fish and their sentience, about aquatic animals and their sentience. So this is, this is actually on the Huon River, which is, I can see the Huon River out my door. And we fortunately don't have a view of these fishing nets, but when we drive up the river, there's, you'll regularly see them there. And, that's what they look like. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of fish crammed into those nets. Excuse me. And the amount of waste from these nets, too, is incredible. And I'll talk about that later as well. But, it's a terrible, they're crammed into those nets and, they're not able to do any of their natural behaviors. But even if they were, even if there was only one fish in there, that fish is a sentient being. So, this is the thing. We have to sort of start thinking in terms of animals being sentient, and that any sort of exploitation, whether we think it's, acceptable or not, whether, we find nice ways of doing the wrong thing, that's what it is. It's nice ways of doing the wrong thing. This is actually an image provided by one of the 4, I think, factory farming fish industries here in Tasmania. And of course, they would probably pick the least offensive, least crammed image they can find. And even if that is the least crammed image they can find, it certainly looks pretty cramped to me. And I think you probably agree. Considering that these fish usually go foraging for miles, and this is it's not acceptable. And oftentimes, large fish will kill smaller fish because of the stress of this. So, a lot of fish now, 50%, I think, are factory farmed like this. So, and they'll always have sustainable written on the packet. But as you can see, it's awful. This is, little salmon hatcheries, the little salmon eggs hatch, and there's millions of them. And it makes me sad to think, that this is their life they have to look forward to. And eventually they're killed, of course. So I just want to talk about I call them the 5 illusions, the RSPCA. If you live in the United States, it's probably called the ASPCA. There's various groups, various large animal organizations are all promoting this idea that there's such a thing as happy animal exploitation, humane animal exploitation. That's often something that is promoted. The Humane Society of the United States likes to put that out all the time. But really, the Humane Society of the United States is just a branch of animal agriculture, really. They actually promote animal products, etc. But anyway, the RSPCA is an Australian sort of a promoter of this happy animal slavery. The RSPCA, the 5 freedoms, which I call the 5 illusions: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease. The last 2, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. Well, I'd like you to keep that in mind as we go through a description of salmon farming. This is in those nets that I talk about. And I'd say that it's probably worse in, say, the United States. Sometimes there can be more extreme practices there. But, of course, if it was applied to humans, it would be considered torture. That's the thing we need to remember, that animal welfare and its reforms have nothing to do with animals and have everything to do with industry and keeping industry economically efficient. And if a industry enacts a particular reform, it probably was going to do it anyway because it was economically efficient to do so. It has nothing to do with the welfare of animals. And in the end, they're all killed anyway. But if these welfare reforms were applied to humans, they would be considered extreme torture. So considering that, non-human animals are sentient beings, where, giving the okay, and large animal organizations are telling the public that it's morally acceptable to use animals in a quote unquote humane way, like this RSPCA 5 Freedoms does, and that's morally acceptable to do that. And it's just a scam to sell animal products. And often these, like the RSPCA, will put RSPCA approved on animal products, and they, I think, get some kickbacks financially from that. So, this is, but it's all a scam to sell animal products. So anyway, just keep that in mind, the RSPCA 5 illusions, as I call them, and keep in mind other humane labels as well when I go through this description of salmon farming. So nearly half of all fish consumed worldwide each year are raised on land or ocean-based aquafarms. Farmed fish spend their entire lives in cramped, filthy enclosures, and many suffer from parasitic infections, diseases, and debilitating injuries. On aquafarms, high-volume systems control food light on indoor farms and growth stimulation. Genetic engineering is used to accelerate growth, and hormones may be injected into fish to change their reproductive behavior. In some countries, fish farmers also add antibiotics to fish food or water, and residues of these drugs have been found in fish sold for human consumption. And just momentarily, 80 to 85% of antibiotics used in the United States are used in animal agriculture. And I've talked about this before, but because it's used prophylactically and in smaller quantities than would be required, it actually causes antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And so a lot of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria we have today originated from animal agriculture. So, that's something to keep in mind. So because they're adapted to navigate vast oceans, and I'm talking about salmon now, and use all their senses to do so, fish suffer immensely because of all the cramped conditions and lack of space on fish farms. The tight enclosures inhibit their ability to navigate properly and cause them to knock against each other and the sides of the enclosures. This jostling causes sores and damages their fins. And to increase profit, fish farmers cram as many fish as possible into the smallest space. As you can see, tens of thousands of fish or more can be crowded into a single farm. Large farms can span the size of 4 football fields and contain more than 1 million fish. In intensely crowded aquafarms, small fish are bullied and killed by larger ones, so fish are continually sorted to make sure that faster-growing individuals are moved to the appropriate size grouping. At each sorting, the fish are netted or pumped out of their tanks and dumped into a series of bars and grates with varied space gaps to divide them by size. Small fish fall through the small gaps, and large fish fall through the large gaps, and redistribute them into different netted cages or tanks. At each sorting, the fish, sorry, I've already said that. So these fish are actually, they're falling through these grates and scraping themselves, and this is done regularly, and it actually requires a lot. It actually is very, very stressful for fish to go through that. As you can imagine, it'd be like you being sort of pushed. You can imagine that happening to oneself. Being jostled about like that and scraping yourself, going through bars. And it's either that or being attacked by larger individuals and being killed, which is what happens to the smaller fish in these fish factory farms. So fish farmers may starve fish for 24 hours before sorting them. This practice is called grading. And it's very stressful and results in painful scrapes and a loss of protective scales, leaving fish vulnerable to disease. High mortality rates, disease and parasite infestations are common. Deformities and stress-related injuries are also a regular occurrence. On some farms, as many as 40% of the fish are blind, a problem that's not addressed because blind fish net the same profit for farmers. Researchers have also found that half of the world's farmed fish may suffer from hearing loss. So imagine that, these poor individuals in these huge nets are crammed in, and they're blind, and they have, they're also deaf. I mean, how monstrous, what an aberration that is, to put sentient animals through that. And then, just having that, being in this sort of situation where you don't know how disorienting that would be, blind and probably deaf at the same time. So many species of farm fish are carnivorous, which means that additional fish must be caught from the already exhausted oceans in order to feed them. It can take 1 pound or more of fish from the ocean to produce 1 pound of farm salmon or sea bass. Now, I'll just talk about the quote-unquote bycatch. When trawlers are fishing, they actually, for every pound of fish that they catch, and they, oftentimes there'll be trawlers that will drag the bottom of the ocean, and whatever gets caught in that, whoever gets caught in that ends up on the deck, and that can be whales or dolphins, sharks. There's about 100 million sharks. 100 million are killed every year in these big trawling events. And a lot of them are thrown overboard. All these, for every 1 pound, there's 4 or 5 pounds of quote-unquote bycatch, which is thrown overboard. So, if we had, say, if we're not vegan and we had a 4-pound fish that we were eating, there would be approximately 16 pounds or 20 pounds of fish, other aquatic animals, it'll be all kinds of animals who are thrown overboard and killed. They're just discarded. So, this is this idea of sustainability. I mean, putting aside that they're sentient animals, all these animals that are thrown overboard and die the most excruciating deaths, and the ones that are kept, the target fish, all of them are sentient. But it's a completely unsustainable, it's a madness. This is ecocide, what we're doing to the planet. Animal agriculture is, equals ecocide, because 51% of greenhouse gases are from animal agriculture. We quibble about the percentage, but just take into account, if you've seen Cowspiracy, the sustainability secret, the information in that is astounding. So I invite you to look at that. But just consider even just this one fact: 1 acre of Amazon rainforest is cleared every minute for animal agriculture and for soy to feed animal agriculture overseas. So just think about what we're doing on land and all the millions of animals that are trapped, poisoned, drowned, and shot to quote-unquote protect animal agriculture. And think about all the sentient beings in the ocean that are dragged up, all of them are dragged up onto trawler decks, whether they're the target fish or not, and they end up dying. That's 5 pounds or 4 or 5 pounds for every 1 pound of the target fish. They are thrown overboard then they just die. And that can be whales, sharks, dolphins, whatever. All the animals that we fetishize, they end up dying. And there's, thousands of them. It's It's I'll post a link to an article that I talked about on my vlog, Faint Signals from Vega, about quote unquote bycatch. And it's unbelievable the amount, like hundreds and hundreds of tons of aquatic animals are just discarded. You know, it's absolutely, for want of a better word, insane. So, you know, we have to think about that in addition to, you know, our use of our use of fish and eating them and, you know, and them being sentient, but all the other destruction that we participate in when we do that. So aquafarmers have also begun to feed fish oil and fish meal you know, which you can find the omega-3s in plants. So, you know, we could actually, this is where fish get their omega-3s. They get them from plants. But aquafarmers are feeding huge amounts of fish oil and fish meal to fish in these aquaculture plants. And the industry uses nearly 70% of the global supply of fish meal and nearly 90% of the global supply of fish oil. So, you know, we're actually feeding fish to fish and using more fish to feed these fish so that then we can eat them. I mean, it's just, you know, what's sustainable about that? So fish farmers lace fish feed with powerful chemicals and antibiotics to help fish survive the deadly diseases caused by severe crowding and filth. It's likely that these fish pellets are the cause of the higher PCB and dioxin contamination levels found in farm fish, which are 7 times higher than the already dangerous levels found in their wild counterparts. Contaminants from ocean-based aquafarms, such as fish excrement, uneaten chemical-laden food, and swarms of parasite, spread to the surrounding ocean, and the rampant disease inside the enclosures is passed on to free-swimming fish in the area, even threatening some populations of wild salmon to the point of extinction. Sea lice, for example, eat at a fish, causing their scales to fall off and creating large sores. In severely crowded conditions, these parasites often eat down to the bone on fish's faces, resulting in what is sometimes called a death crown. So can you imagine that? And this is not uncommon, that animals, fish in these factory farms, these large nets, do get fish lice, and they end up, you know, can you imagine having that eaten down to the bone? And of course they die, but they suffer tremendously. So, you know, this is sort of like, it's a torture. I mean, this is sort of like industry, it's like RSPCA approved torture. This is the so-called happy animal farming that we hear about so often. Sustainable, humane. This is normal. This is normal. The normal runnings of any facility involves torture. So in the United States, nearly 40% of farm fish die before the aquafarm operator is ready to slaughter them. Fish who survive are starved before they are sent to slaughter in order to reduce waste contamination of the water during transport. Salmon, for example, are starved for up to 10 days. So can you imagine that? I mean, think about this RSPCA 5 freedoms, the 5 illusions. Think about that, and think about what I've just talked about, just even in this example. 10 days these salmon are starved. 10 days. And many traditional methods of slaughtering fish are They suffocate fish either in the air or on ice, leaving them to endure pain and terror for 10 minutes or more before finally dying, piercing their hearts or severing their gill arches without prior stunning, and chilling the water temperature, which immobilizes fish but may leave them fully conscious before killing them with carbon dioxide. Well, that's charming, isn't it? I mean, it's such a joke. When I read about the normal runnings of any animal industry, this is, it's full of this kind of thing. It's full of it. So, I got that information. I sourced that information from a large animal organization, PETA, who, by the way, I do not endorse because they promote happy animal slavery, they promote animal welfare reform, and they promote so-called humane ways of killing. And they talk out of both sides of their mouth. There's a whole bunch of things that is wrong with PETA, sexism, and their porn site that they have. There's a bunch of things. They give awards to slaughterhouse designers and animal businesses and all sorts of things. So there's a real problem with it. But anyway, they actually had a pretty good some good information about fish farming, which I thought I would use to the benefit of promoting veganism, which is what I promote. I don't promote happy animal slavery, humane animal use, because there's no such thing. And even if there were, it would still be wrong. So anyway, there's, the thing that I've talked about earlier is that aqua farming and, which is factory farming of fish, and land animal agriculture, they're both completely unsustainable. They're full of violence, and oftentimes the amount of food, like for example, to make 1 pound of cow flesh, you have to give the cow 7 pounds of plant material. And oftentimes it's grain that is grown in countries who are struggling. Their populations are starving, and here they are growing grain to transport to Western countries so that they can feed 7 pounds of grain to an animal that shouldn't really be eating grain, like cows. It isn't good for them, and to make 1 pound of their flesh. It's, I mean, it's really crazy. This is crazy stuff. It's like when we're feeding more fish to the fish that are going to be fed to people, and then all the bycatch, the so-called bycatch that is killed also. Like it ends up being, it's totally ridiculous. For every 1 pound of fish, there's like 4 or 5 pounds of animals that are, they're thrown away, aquatic animals. I mean, so, it's an insanity. So, this is something that we need to think about. So the industry spends an estimated $1 billion a year. I don't know if this is the U.S. industry on veterinary products. They degrade the land, and they pollute local waters. According to a recent report by World Watch Institute, a salmon farm with 200,000 fish releases nutrients and fecal matter roughly equivalent to, and wait for it, as many as 60,000 people, and imperils wild populations who come into contact with farmed salmon. So 200,000 fish release nutrients and fecal matter roughly equivalent to as many as 60,000 people. I mean, get your head around that. That's really, really out there. Anyway, just for example, in the area that I live in, up north, in 2015, there was 85,000 salmon suffocated in the Macquarie Harbour. and this will be a more common event when, due to climate change, which, by the way, if we're not vegan, we're contributing to with the 51% of greenhouse gases from animal agriculture. So, there's going to be more and more extreme weather events which will cause mass die-offs. In fact, I was reading that the industries here are expecting mortality events to be a given. So mortality events meaning, say 200,000 fish just die because of, say, a surge in seawater, which decreases the oxygen because they have high levels. They require high levels of oxygen because they're eating sort of rich food. When I say rich, it's probably food that, it's dense nutrients. So they require more oxygen. So it's easy for them to suffocate if they don't have decent levels of oxygen in the water. So temperature spikes cause that. And, this fish were, struggle to breathe, and they're so stressed they stop feeding. That's what happens. But they're expecting that these mass mortality events will occur more often. That's, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of fish, suffocating. And what for? Because we don't need animal products to survive. In fact, in the amounts we're eating them, we can get all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources. And in the amounts that we're eating them, and I'll talk about the problems with salmon flesh shortly, but in the amounts we're eating them, it's killing us. It doesn't really belong in our bodies. And in fact, there should really be, when you start to look at the science behind, for example, if you go to nutritionfacts.org, you find out a lot of science-backed information. They scan all the nutrition journals and the science journals and the medical journals about plant-based diets and also about animal product consumption. And it's a real nightmare reading the animal product, the negative effects of animal product consumption. So, this is, they should come with warning labels almost, these, I think anyway, animal products. So I'll just tell you a little bit about health in relation to, say, salmon flesh, eating salmon flesh. So in a nationwide study linking industrial toxins and diabetes was published in 2006. Since then, Harvard researchers reported a link between persistent pollutants like hexachlorobenzene and diabetes in the nurses' health study. This is supported by an analysis they did of 6 other studies published since 2006 that showed the same thing. They conclude that, quote, past accumulation and continued exposure to these persistent pollutants may be a potent risk factor for developing diabetes, end quote. Where is the hexachlorobenzene found? In a US supermarket survey, salmon and sardines were most heavily tainted with hexachlorobenzene, with salmon, quote, the most contaminated food of all, especially farm salmon, perhaps, quote, the greatest source of dietary pollutants, end quote, averaging nearly 10 times the PCB load of wild-caught salmon. So that's scary. Now, I was non-vegan for, 45 years of my life. I've been vegan for 12 years. Best decision I ever made. But I actually used to eat fish fairly. In fact, at one point, I was a pescatarian, a very stupid thing to be, thinking that, what was I thinking? Fish are sentient, and just because they have what I thought were fish that were swimming around in the ocean, therefore it's okay then for me to have them killed and eat them? Really? But I was a pescatarian for a few years, and I was vegetarian other times. And I think about all the fish and other aquatic animals that I ate during that time, including crustaceans like crabs And I've talked about the terrible things that are done to lobsters and crabs, dumping them in boiling water. And, I've never actually cooked crustaceans myself, but somebody else has cooked them for me because I was a pescatarian and I was eating, aquatic animals. So, it's very, very sad. All these strange, flexitarian, pescatarian, and all these weird sorts of where it's very morally confused. That's why I talk about veganism. I don't suggest anybody cut back on anything. I don't suggest anybody, exclude one species after another in some slow, quote unquote, journey. That to me, because veganism is an ethical position, just like any other ethical position, you don't do it in half measures. You don't sort of say, well, I'm only going to be racist for 3 days a week and the other 4 days I'm not going to be. You don't do that. When you are against racism, hopefully you embrace that and you do your best to address it in yourself on a daily basis. And that's what you do with any ethical position, and that's what veganism is. Unfortunately, most people are told all sorts of misinformation and disinformation about what veganism is, that it's a diet, that it's a healthy choice or something, which it is, of course, but that's not what veganism is. Ancillary benefits of veganism are health and environment and a whole host of things that come with that. But veganism itself is an ethical position. So when you embrace an ethical position, you embrace it wholeheartedly, and you reject all forms of a exploitation, all forms of a discrimination. You reject it. And so you don't sort of, for some reason, people seem to make this, some animal advocates and large animal organizations seem to have this very odd idea that, they do totally different things from human rights groups. They call themselves animal rights groups, but they promote happy animal exploitation. Well, there's nothing rights about that. So that's what I want to get clear here, is that, I don't promote happy animal exploitation or humane use of animals. I just only promote veganism. And I hope that other people will realize why that is and will reject any sorts of calls to cut back on things and reduce, animal products and only eat this sort of animal and not that sort of animal, or that, I'll start with being a vegetarian. None of that, all of that is morally inconsistent, and all of that still involves violence. So that's why I talk about veganism only. So, I'll just talk a little bit more about health because I said I would, and just to give you an idea of some of the problems, fish such as salmon are often promoted as an excellent source of long-chain omega-3s. They are often contaminated with mercury and other toxic pollutants. It's best for all concerned if we obtain our long-chain omega-3s from plant-based supplements. U.S. retail salmon was recently studied and, quote, organically farmed, end quote, salmon with skin was found to be most contaminated with PBDEs, compounds in flame retardants. These toxins are not neutralized by cooking. Grilled chicken flesh is the only animal product that beats grilled salmon for certain carcinogenic contamination. Fish, including salmon, has often been found to be contaminated in fecal bacteria, above what the national guidelines permit. The consumption of salmon, as well as other dark fish flesh, appear to be linked to atrial fibrillation, and that's really just a heart problem, a cardiac condition. And feed additives given to farm salmon to dye their flesh may be linked to a condition in consumers called gold dust retinopathy. And retinopathy is a condition where the retina starts to degrade and eventually one goes blind. That happens when one has untreated diabetes, and if one is not sort of addressing that, eventually one can go blind. So that's what retinopathy is. So that's charming that the dye in their flesh may be linked to that. And they've actually, there was a Four Corners report. Four Corners is a journalist organization that did a particular expose on the salmon industry here, and they discovered that I think it was tassel, actually put dye in the flesh of salmon. And after this expose, they said, oh, well, we won't put that, we won't use that particular dye, or they won't do it at all. I don't know. But the fact, this is the thing. It's like all they want to do, industries just want to sell animal products. They don't particularly care about the consumer that much. They only care when they get caught. And they don't, they only do something, they only change something for animals in these, in these facilities when it's economically efficient to do so. So that's what industry does. So I'll just talk a little bit about fish oil supplements, because that's something that the medical profession, they push fish oil supplements, and that's, there's a huge billion-dollar industry of fish oil supplements. Fish oil distillation process was found ineffective at removing all the industrial contaminants from fish oil, so even PCB-free fish oil may be anything but. There's a law in California in the US that makes it illegal to sell toxic substances that cause cancer or birth defects without at least a warning label. The Environmental Justice Foundation was not able to find such a label on fish oil, and so they sued the CVS, the GNC, Rite Aid, along with the major fish oil manufacturers. And to do so, they had to prove that fish oil one finds in stores actually contains PCBs. So they went out and purchased 10 different fish oil supplements and then tested them. And some had 70 times the PCB of others and 240 times the toxicity. So, you might be thinking that your doctor's suggesting that you purchase fish oil because you've got high cholesterol or some situation like that, or, that it's good for your mental health or something. And then, but really it's probably loaded with toxins. This is just one of the many reasons why we should obtain omega-3s from plant-based sources. And there are a number of plant-based sources now, vegan sources, that you can get omega-3s from. You just have to look online for them. So, and you don't get the many risks of toxins if you choose these microalgae or yeast-based EPA, DHA supplements. It's a nutritionally equivalent and safe and convenient source, and it doesn't have the toxic waste, and most importantly, it doesn't have the violence. That's what I'm all about. So what's the latest science? What does the latest science say about the consumption of fish oil capsules and oily fish for health reasons? A systematic review and meta-analysis published in the Journal of American Medical, the Journal of the American Medical Association, looked at all the best randomized clinical trials evaluating the effects of omega-3s on lifespan, cardiac death, sudden death, heart attack, and stroke. So what did they find? Overall, they found no protective benefit for overall mortality, heart disease mortality, sudden cardiac death, heart attack, or stroke. So why are these supplements pushed? All you have to do is follow the money. Isn't that the case? It's $1 billion business. And since we don't need to eat animal products at all to survive, as I've said, and we can meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources, then consuming them is not only unnecessary, but it's morally unjustifiable. So some of that information was from nutritionfacts.org, and I invite you to check that out. I always have a disclaimer about any sources, groups, individuals that I mention, any blogs, whatever, that are outside what I do, because, it's good to have a disclaimer because you never know what's going to happen in the future. So that's just something I wanted to add. So anyway, that's really all I wanted to sort of talk about with in relation to salmon farming and fish factory farming in general, because a lot of people think when they haven't heard about veganism, they think, well, they try and most people think that animals morally matter. We think animals morally matter, and so we're always trying to, we think it's important to, quote unquote, reduce cruelty. We think that, sort of if we buy these, sort of sustainable animal products, that we're doing the right thing by the environment. And when they have these, sort of labels on them, like the RSPCA approved or the 5-step humane labels and all this sort of nonsense, we think, well, we can discharge our moral responsibility in a way or we can feel like our conscience is soothed, and we go to bed feeling like these animals live sort of happy lives until they were killed. That's what we tell ourselves. And this is what these producers of these so-called humane animal products are hoping that you will think, that we will think, that these animals lived happy lives and that it's morally acceptable to exploit them and kill them because they lived happy lives. Of course, they all end up in the same awful, horrific slaughterhouse. But, they don't live happy lives. It's a non-consensual, would be considered torture if applied to humans. There's nothing remotely happy. There's nothing that it involves taking their children. It involves reproductive manipulation and sexual assault. If you've ever heard about the apparatus called a rape rack, which is something that the dairy industry uses to artificially inseminate cows. And if you've heard the description of that, it's pretty horrific. There's a whole host of horrific things that go on in industry, and it's all seen as completely necessary for that sort of animal animal industry. It's like there's necessary cruelty and so-called unnecessary cruelty. The necessary cruelty is what every industry has, and which is appalling. And this is the nature of industry. It's all about economic efficiency, and they don't care about non-human animals. But whether it's humane, whether these animals are stroked to sleep every night and they have their own separate beds, and whether at the time of their killing they're sung to sleep, and then their throat is slit and they're played Mozart, it doesn't matter. The fact is, they're sentient, and we don't have the right to use them. No matter how, nicely we think we're exploiting them, we don't have the right to use them. So that's the thing I would like you to take from any of my vegan live streams, that message, that the answer is to go vegan, to stop using animals for food. That's dairy, eggs, meat, and honey, etc. Clothing, that's leather, wool, fur, silk, etc. And entertainment and other reasons. We don't need to use animals at all. For any purpose, really. We can easily meet all our requirements, our nutritional requirements from plants and other animal sources, and there's alternatives to, to all these clothing that is made from animal products. So we don't need to participate in this violence. So why would we, when we really do believe that animals morally matter? Because we wouldn't be searching for these so-called sustainable, humane animal products if we didn't think that these animals had had sentience. That we wouldn't be looking for that. We wouldn't care if we just thought they were automatons that had no sentience. So we recognize their sentience, and that's why, there's these increases in the availability of these happy animal products that are really just scams. So let's bypass that now and just forget about this sort of myth of humane animal use and just go vegan. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to do another vegan live stream soon, which is going to be on my own personal experience in relation to fish and other aquatic animals. And I'm going to talk about that and share somebody else's experience. So I hope that you will join me for that next live stream, which could be even after this. I'm not sure, but it'll be soon. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/vegantrove, VEGANTROVE. And you can subscribe to my vlog live stream blog, which is faintsignalsfromvega.com. You can find that in the frame. And if you need any assistance at all to go vegan, I'll just put my podcast address. So howtogovegan.org. So that's really that's a podcast that I've made, which has all the ethical considerations of why one should be vegan, and has nutrition information, and it's a comprehensive vegan resource. So I hope that you will check that out. And so my name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.